My name is Pastor Rayan Buckner. I'm 54 years old, and for the last 20 years, my life has been measured in Sunday mornings, midweek Bible studies, and the rhythmic creak of the floorboards in the sanctuary of New Hope Fellowship in Richmond, Virginia. It was November 12th, 2025, a Wednesday. We were midway through a standard prayer meeting. The air in the room smelled like damp coats and the peppermint candy Sister Hattie always keeps in her purse. I remember looking down at my Bible, my thumb resting on the edge of the page, when the world didn't just tilt, it dissolved. It started as a sharp, metallic tang in the back of my throat, followed by a pressure behind my eyes that felt like someone was tightening a vice. I tried to say, "Let us pray," but the words came out as a wet, ragged wheeze. My knees hit the carpet first, the sound muffled by the heavy industrial weave. I saw the blurred shapes of my deacons rushing forward, their faces twisted in that specific kind of panic you only see when people realize their rock is breaking. I wanted to tell them I was fine, but my heart was doing something violent inside my chest. A chaotic, fluttering gallop that felt less like a pulse and more like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. The medical terminology for it is ventricular fibrillation. To me, it felt like being pulled underwater by my ankles. I could hear the frantic shouting of my wife, Elena. Her voice was a high, thin reed cutting through the low murmurs of the congregation. Someone was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythmic thud of chest compressions vibrating through the floor and into my failing nervous system. I felt the ribs on my left side give way with a sickening, internal pop. There was no white light yet, just the cold, hard reality of the linoleum as they rolled me onto my back, and the sudden, stinging smell of smelling salts that did absolutely nothing. My vision tunneled until the only thing left was the flickering fluorescent light above the pulpit, and then, with one final, agonizing shudder of my lungs, that light went out too. I wasn't in the church anymore. I wasn't in my body. I was standing in the silence between heartbeats, watching the paramedics fumble with the paddles of a defibrillator, seeing the sweat on their brows as if I were a stranger hovering 3 feet above the scene of my own expiration. The transition from the chaos of the sanctuary to the sterile, pressurized environment of the ICU at VCU Medical Center was a blur of disjointed sensory inputs. I was dead for 6 minutes and 42 seconds, but time doesn't work the same way when your brain is starved of oxygen and your soul is sitting in the corner of the room. I watched them slide the endotracheal tube down my throat, a thick, plastic intrusion that looked violent against my pale skin. The monitors were a symphony of frantic electronics, the EKG line a flat, green horizon that refused to break. I saw Dr. Eris, a woman I'd visited a dozen times to pray for other congregants, shaking her head as she checked my pupils. There was a profound, heavy stillness in the room despite the noise. I was acutely aware of the clinical nature of my departure. I saw the blood on the sleeve of my Sunday suit, the one Elena had meticulously ironed that morning. I saw the way the nursing staff stepped back for a moment, that brief, professional hesitation that happens right before they call the time of death. It was in that pocket of silence, that absolute, airless vacuum, that the hospital room began to bleed away. The walls didn't disappear. They grew heavy, shifting from painted drywall to something ancient and dense. I found myself standing in what I can only describe as a waiting room of shadows. It wasn't heaven, and it wasn't hell. It was the porch of eternity. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath, but I had no lungs to breathe with. I felt a sudden, crushing grief. Not for my life, but for the things I had left unfinished. I thought about the church budget, the roof leak in the parsonage, and the sermon notes for next Sunday sitting on my desk. How small they seemed now. How utterly insignificant. I turned around, expecting to see a tunnel or a gate, but instead, I saw a figure standing by a window that shouldn't have existed. The window looked out not onto Richmond, but onto a timeline, a series of events unfolding like a fast-forwarded film. And there, standing in the center of that shifting light, was the presence I had spent my entire life preaching about, but realized in that moment I had never truly known. He didn't look like a painting. He looked like the sun condensed into the shape of a man, and the weight of his gaze made the 6 minutes of my clinical death feel like 1,000 years of scrutiny. The figure didn't approach me. The distance between us simply ceased to exist. One moment I was staring at the flickering fluorescent ghost of the ICU, and the next, I was standing in a space that felt like the interior of a diamond, sharp, clear, and terrifyingly vast. He didn't have the soft, feathered edges of the Sunday school portraits I'd grown up with. Jesus stood there with the weight of a mountain. His skin was the color of burnished bronze, deep and weathered, and his eyes weren't just looking at me. They were looking through every sermon I'd ever preached, peeling back the layers of my Pastor Ryan persona until only the scared boy from East Richmond remained. He didn't speak with his mouth at first. The communication was a sudden, overwhelming download of intent that vibrated in my very marrow. I felt the specific gravity of his sorrow. It wasn't a distant, divine pity. It was the raw, jagged grief of a father watching his children walk toward a cliff while laughing. He gestured toward that impossible window, and the glass seemed to ripple like water. "Ryan," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice felt like a physical reconstruction of my soul. "You have spent 20 years telling them how to live. Now, you must see what happens when they refuse to listen." The window began to show me images of the coming months, but they weren't flashes of light or abstract clouds. They were grounded, gritty scenes of the world I knew. I saw the calendar pages flip with a sickening speed: December, January, February. The air in this vision felt different. It was charged with a static electricity, a tension that made my skin crawl. I saw people I recognized from my own pews standing in lines, their faces etched with a hollow, hungry desperation I'd only ever seen in history books. I saw the digital displays on their phones, bank apps flashing red, messages from employers that weren't requests, but ultimatums. The normalcy we all clung to was fraying at the edges like a cheap rug. Jesus stood beside me, his hand resting on a ledge that felt as solid as oak, and I realized he wasn't showing me the end of the world. He was showing me the end of our illusions. The timeline slowed as it reached a specific point, a shifting of the light that felt like the beginning of a long, cold shadow. The date appeared in my mind with the clarity of a courtroom verdict: March 2026. As the vision settled on this period, the atmosphere changed. The lush, hopeful green of a typical Virginia spring was missing. Instead, the imagery was dominated by a heavy, overcast gray, not of rain, but of a profound social stillness. I saw the doors of New Hope Fellowship, my own church, but they weren't open for service. There were chains on the handles, heavy and rusted, and a notice taped to the glass that had been partially torn away by the wind. "The shaking begins in the house," he said, and his voice held a resonance that made the floor beneath us tremble. I saw a montage of faces, other pastors I knew, men I'd shared stages with at conventions. I saw them sitting in darkened offices, staring at ledgers and legal documents. I saw the compromise in their eyes. They were being asked to choose between the truth they claimed to serve and the survival of their institutions. The tension wasn't coming from a foreign invader or a natural disaster. It was coming from within. I saw a specific scene, a family dinner at a home I recognized. The father was shouting, his face purple with rage, while the mother sat in a catatonic silence, staring at a stack of bills on the kitchen table. The divide wasn't just political or social. It was spiritual, a literal tearing of the fabric of the American family. Jesus leaned closer, and for the first time, I felt a spark of genuine fear. Not for my life. I was already dead, but for what was being demanded of me. By the spring of 2026, he explained, the middle ground will vanish. The fence that so many of my people have sat on for decades will be electrified. You see the tension in the streets now? That is merely the wind before the hurricane. In the spring of that year, a decision will be forced upon every soul. It will manifest as a choice of bread, a choice of safety, and a choice of silence. He showed me a grocery store, the Kroger on Carey Street where I buy my milk. The shelves were half empty, but that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was the way the shoppers looked at each other, with a predator's calculation. The social contract was dissolving. "This is not an ending, Ryan," he whispered, and the intensity of his gaze burned. "This is the winnowing. The wheat and the tares are about to be separated by a wind that no one can hide from." The vision didn't stay in the streets. It forced its way into the one place I thought was safe, my own home. The transition was jarringly intimate. I was standing in my kitchen in Richmond, the sunlight hitting the chipped ceramic of my favorite coffee mug on the counter. But the silence in the house wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Saturday morning. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a standoff. I saw Elena, my wife of 31 years, sitting at the small oak table where we've shared 1,000 meals. Her Bible was open, but she wasn't reading it. She was staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over a notification that seemed to make her entire body tremble. "Look closer, Ryan," the voice beside me commanded. I leaned in, and I saw the screen. It was a message from our eldest son, Andre. He wasn't asking for prayer or checking in. He was telling her he couldn't come for Easter. The language was cold, clinical, and laced with a new kind of ideological poison that had replaced the love we raised him with. He was calling us obstructions. He was telling her that for his own safety and social standing, he had to distance himself from the church and everything we stood for. I watched my wife's hand shake as she set the phone down. She didn't cry. She just looked old. She looked like the foundation of her world had turned to sand. This was the personal fracture Jesus had warned me about. The spring of 2026 wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a wedge driven into the heart of the family. I saw myself, or the version of me that would return to that body, walking into the room, and I saw the way Elena looked at me. There was a flicker of something that looked like resentment. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted me to say the words that would bring our son back, to compromise just enough to keep the family whole. But the spirit in that room was clear. The price of that peace was the truth. I felt the agonizing weight of having to choose between the woman I loved and the mandate I had been given. It wasn't a cinematic battle. It was a quiet, devastating realization that the gospel was finally doing exactly what it promised, dividing the soul and the spirit, the joints and the marrow. The crystalline space shifted again, pulling me from the heights of divine revelation down into the gritty, dimly lit reality of a corporate boardroom. This wasn't a place of worship. It was a place of business, smelling of expensive leather and stale coffee. I saw a man I recognized, Bishop Henderson, a mentor who had laid hands on me at my ordination. He was sitting across from 3 men in sharp, charcoal suits. They weren't demons. They were lawyers and bureaucrats, their faces practiced in a mask of professional concern. "The choice is simple, Bishop," one of the men said, tapping a stylus against a tablet. "The new community standards for nonprofit compliance are non-negotiable by the spring of 2026. If New Hope and its sister churches want to keep their essential service status, the language in your bylaws regarding certain social exclusions has to be modernized. We're not asking you to stop preaching. We're asking you to stop offending the public peace." I watched Henderson's face. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the gospel. He was thinking about the multi-million-dollar youth center he'd just broken ground on. He was thinking about the payroll for 40 staff members. He was thinking about the optics. "It's for the greater good," Henderson whispered, more to himself than to them. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the hospital AC. This was the moral compromise Jesus had warned me about. The spring of 2026 wasn't just a date, it was a filter. I saw the bishop pick up the pen. As he signed the document, the light in the room seemed to dim, as if a physical source of power had been severed. Jesus stood beside me, his expression unreadable, but his presence heavy with a righteous sorrow. "He thinks he is saving the building," he told me, "but he is only decorating a tomb. By March, the buildings that stand will be the ones that have bartered their souls for a tax ID number. The true church will be found in the places that have lost everything." I realized then that my own church, my beloved New Hope, would face this exact table. The pressure wouldn't come from a riot. It would come from a polite man with a briefcase and a deadline. The vision narrowed until the world was nothing but a single, glowing screen. It was my bank's mobile app, the blue and white interface I checked every morning. But the numbers I saw there made my heart, the spirit version of it, at least, stop. My balance was a frozen grayed-out 0. A notification banner at the top read, "Account restricted, compliance review pending. Please visit a regional center with updated biometric verification and signed acknowledgement of the 2026 Social Responsibility Accord." "This is how the hand is forced," Jesus said, and his voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "It is not a mark on the skin that begins the end, Ryan. It is the squeeze on the stomach. I saw myself, the Ryan who would return, standing in a grocery store line. My cart had bread, eggs, and a gallon of milk. I watched as the cashier, a young girl with tired eyes, shook her head. My card wouldn't process, not because there wasn't money, but because the status of my account had been flagged. The system knew I had refused to sign the modernization papers at the church. The confrontation was silent and humiliating. People in line behind me started to mutter. I saw a deacon from a neighboring church, a man I'd gone fishing with, turn his head away, pretending he didn't see me struggling. He had signed his papers. His card worked just fine. The social or public tension wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing exclusion. I was being erased from the world I lived in. You will be tempted to hate them, he warned, his hand gripping my shoulder with a strength that felt like it was holding my very atoms together. You will be tempted to use your tongue to curse the system instead of using your life to trust me. In the spring of 2026, your faith will no longer be a series of beliefs. It will be your only currency. If you do not learn to live on the manna of my word now, you will starve when the digital bread fails. The weight of the choice was suffocating. I had to choose, feed my family by bowing to the image of the age, or trust a king who was currently showing me my own poverty. The crystalline expanse didn't just show me the world. It began to pull me into the very mechanics of the soul's decision. Jesus stood before me, and for the first time, his expression wasn't one of sorrow or warning, but of a terrifyingly pure expectation. "Ryan," he said, and the vibration of his voice felt like it was recalibrating my heartbeat. In the spring of 2026, the question will not be what you believe. The question will be what you are willing to lose. Most men believe in me only as long as I am the guarantor of their comfort. But when I become the reason for their hunger, that is when the sheep are known. He showed me a vision of my own study at the church. I was sitting at my desk, the lamp casting a long, jittery shadow against the wall. On the desk were two documents. One was the Social Responsibility Accord, the same one Bishop Henderson had signed. It was written in a language that sounded almost like the Bible: inclusion, harmony, public safety, and the common good. It promised that if I signed, New Hope's accounts would be unfrozen, our building would remain a designated community hub, and my family would have their digital access restored. The second document was a blank sheet of paper. It represented the unknown. It represented the wilderness. "The outcome is determined by the appetite," he repeated. "If you hunger for the approval of the city, you will eat the bread of the city, but you will starve in the spirit. If you hunger for me, you will walk out of that building with nothing but my hand." I felt the physical pull of the compromise. It wasn't a sudden demonic temptation. It was a slow, reasonable, logical slide. I thought of Elena's face. I thought of the mortgage. I thought of the elderly members of my congregation who relied on our food pantry, a pantry that would be shut down by the state if I didn't comply. The personal choice wasn't just about me. It was about the people I loved. To stay pure, I would have to watch them suffer. To save them, I would have to betray the one standing in front of me. The tension was an iron band tightening around my chest, more painful than the heart attack that had brought me here. The light began to fade, but not into darkness. It became heavy and thick, like honey. The vastness of the crystalline room started to contract, pulling me back toward the cold, cramped reality of the hospital. "Remember the spring, Ryan," Jesus whispered, and though his voice was fading, it was clearer than any sound I had ever heard. It begins with a whisper of safety and ends with a scream of compliance. Do not look to the left or the right. Look to the grain of wheat that falls into the earth and dies. Suddenly, the weight of my physical body slammed into my consciousness like a freight train. The first thing I felt was the raw, burning agony in my chest, the ribs that had been snapped during CPR. The second thing was the cold, invasive plastic of the ventilator tube in my throat. I tried to gasp, but the machine forced a breath into me with a mechanical, rhythmic hiss thump. My eyes flew open, but the world was a blurred smear of clinical whites and blues. I could hear the beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor, steady now, but mocking in its regularity. I saw Dr. Eris standing over me, her face a mask of disbelief. She was holding a clipboard, her pen frozen midair. "He's back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Pastor? Ryan? Can you hear me?" I couldn't nod. I couldn't speak. I was trapped in a body that felt like a cage of broken glass, but my mind was still vibrating with the frequency of the timeline. I looked past the doctor to the small television mounted in the corner of the ICU room. The news was on, muted, but the scrolling ticker at the bottom caught my eye. It was November 2025. The headlines: "We're talking about new digital identity frameworks and interstate commerce stability acts." To the world, it was just politics. To me, it was the sound of the clock ticking toward March. I felt a tear leak out of the corner of my eye and trailed down into my ear. I wasn't crying because I was alive. I was crying because I knew what I had to tell Elena, and I knew that the man who had died on that church floor was never truly coming back. The return to body wasn't a rescue. It was a deployment into a war zone that no one else could see yet. Leaving the hospital was not the homecoming I had imagined. The discharge papers felt like a temporary stay of execution, and as Elena drove me back to our small brick ranch in the West End, the world looked identical, yet entirely alien. The autumn leaves were a fiery red, but all I could see was the coming gray of March. My chest was a map of deep purple bruises, and every breath was a reminder of the ribs that had cracked under the weight of my resuscitation. We sat in the driveway for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. Elena reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine for the man she knew. I couldn't tell her yet. I couldn't tell her that her son's voice on the phone would soon turn to ice. The real-world confirmation didn't happen with a trumpet blast. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my heart stopped. I was sitting in my home office, the one with the sagging bookshelves and the smell of old parchment, when the mail arrived. Among the bills and the flyers for lawn care was a thick, official envelope from the Richmond City Treasury. My hands shook as I slid it open. It wasn't a tax bill. It was a notice of reclassification. The city was citing a new municipal ordinance, one that had passed quietly while I was in a coma, that revoked the property tax exemption for religious organizations that did not meet the community cohesion standards by the first quarter of 2026. I looked at the date at the bottom of the page. The deadline for the first compliance audit was March 15th, 2026. My breath hitched. This was the first brick in the wall Jesus had shown me. It wasn't a fever dream, it was a blueprint. I walked to the window and looked out at my neighborhood. Mr. Henderson was mowing his lawn. A delivery truck was double parked down the street. Everything looked so normal, so sturdy, but I knew the foundation was already hollowed out. I went to my computer and logged into the church's administrative portal. There, in the Messages tab, was a notification from our bank. It was an invitation to a webinar regarding the social responsibility transition. I felt a cold, physical weight settle in my gut. The trap wasn't being set, it was being sprung. The final proof. The one irreversible grounded event didn't come from the city or the bank. It came from my own flesh and blood. It was a rainy Thursday in early December when Andre showed up at the front door. He didn't have his usual smirk. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting to the street before he stepped inside. We sat in the living room, the silence between us so thick it felt like a physical barrier. He didn't ask about my heart. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He pulled out his phone and showed me a QR code that pulsed with a soft, blue light. "Dad?" he said, his voice flat and drained of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. "I've been vetted. I'm in the first wave of the integrity pilot. If you and Mom don't register the church as a safe haven under the new guidelines by March, my status gets flagged. They'll see you as high-risk affiliates. I'll lose my position at the firm. I'll lose my apartment." I looked at my son. The boy I'd baptized in the river, the man I'd cheered for at graduation, and I saw a stranger. He wasn't asking for my blessing. He was asking for my surrender. He was the human face of the ultimatum Jesus had shown me in that crystalline room. This was the fracture that could never be mended with a simple apology. I walked him to the door, my hand resting on the cold brass knob. As he stepped out into the rain, he turned back, his face silhouetted against the street lamp. "Don't be a martyr for a ghost, Dad," he whispered. "The world is changing in the spring. Either change with it, or get left in the dark." I watched his taillights disappear around the corner, and I knew that when March 2026 arrived, I would have to choose between my son's future and my master's hand. I went back into the kitchen, where Elena was humming a hymn while she dried the dishes. I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. The red numbers flickered, marking the seconds, the minutes, the hours, drawing us closer to the winnowing. I sat down at the table, picked up my Bible, and felt the sharp, lingering ache in my broken ribs. The warning was no longer a vision. It was the air I was breathing. I'm still waiting for the spring. If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.